My name is Judyth Sachs. I'm Chief Academic Officer of Studiosity. As part of our commitment to reconciliation, every year we have a number of conversations with Indigenous leaders about reconciliation, what it means for them, and what they see their contribution can be made to the institutions in which they work. These people are leaders and educators whose remit is to make a difference to supporting Indigenous students to be successful. So listen, learn, and enjoy the conversations with these Indigenous leaders as our contribution to Reconciliation Week. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Leanne Holt, Deputy Vice Chancellor Indigenous from University of New South Wales. Leanne has had a remarkable career, both at University of Newcastle, Macquarie University, and now UNSW. Our conversation today, Leanne, is actually for you to tell us about your journey as an Indigenous learner and an Indigenous leader, but also to focus on reconciliation, what reconciliation means for you, and how you translate the principles of reconciliation into your daily work in a university. So tell me about Leanne. Who is Leanne?
Yeah, so I've been in higher education now for nearly 30 years. And my first university, as you said, was at Newcastle, and I was there for 19 years. And then at Macquarie for 7, and now I've been at UNSW for 2.5 years. So it's been quite a remarkable journey. And I was just before we started recording, talking to Judith about, my first appointment were at a Rimba campus of the University of Newcastle, and which is a dual sector campus, and at the time was very everything was very embedded. It wasn't a matter of having TAFE staff and university staff. Although we were employed by the university, we had access to all of the TAFE systems. We had knowledge of all of the vocational education requirements and programs. And so it didn't matter if someone came to the campus wanting to know about TAFE or university or community college, which we also had. We had that breadth of knowledge, which I think was so valuable. And it's going to be really interesting. Interesting that that skill and that experience is going to come back around, I think, while we're talking when we're talking about harmonization and through ATEC. And so I think that it was a really valuable beginning for me, because when I came for the interview at University of Newcastle, and it was an Indigenous identified role as prospective student advisor working in schools with low socioeconomics areas. Very much encouraging first in family. I had never stepped foot on a university campus before. So I had been going to TAFE at night, doing a diploma of human resources, and working full time. And I decided that I wanted to work for public service government. Just quietly, it was because I was about to get married and I wanted to get a job that had maternity leave. So it wasn't about education at all. I had applied for a number of public positions. But the Indigenous liaison officer at the TAFE said, you should apply for this position. And I'm like, well, you better tell me what I need to say if I get an interview. And obviously he prepped me very well because I did get the role, and here I am. So I think that I've been very privileged, sort of sometimes to just be in the right place at the right time. But once I started at the university, I also realized that my TAFE diploma would give me entry into university, which I actually never, and university was never in my trajectory. So I never had considered that. I didn't finish year 12. My last report said I was wasting the educational resources of the school, and they suggested that maybe school wasn't for me. And I was in year 11 at that stage, and so I finished year 12, and not finishing year 12. I just then had never imagined that university was going to be. I thought you had to go to year 12 to actually go to university, which I think is, again, is a really important insight for me about what perspectives are outside that we just take for granted. And I remember back to what I thought when I'm talking to people in the community. And so to find out that my diploma not only gave me entry, but also gave me credit, it was like, quite exciting. And so I started studying and I actually didn't end up going on to complete an undergrad. I found out then that the work experience that I had plus the diploma would actually give me entry into a graduate certificate. And working full time and doing a graduate certificate was a lot easier than actually doing an undergraduate degree at that time of my life, because I was in my very late 20s at that stage. So people can do the maths. And so I did the graduate certificate, went on to a graduate diploma, went on to a master's, started doing a Doctor of Business Administration, and then changed over to a PhD and did a PhD. So I spent 15 years studying while working full time. But I think that's important, because for people working in the sector who want to get into a leadership role, I think it's important that they just plod along. I sort of say, do one subject a semester or a term and just keep on moving towards hiring your qualifications, because that's going to be really important for leadership and development, especially if you want to work in the sector.
That's an extraordinary story
Sorry,
about.
Judith, you asked me a question about reconciliation as well.
But that's an extraordinary story about how, in inverted commas, school did not suit you at that time. But in fact, what you demonstrated in your later life is to learn through a more flexible mode, and a mode that in fact was more inclusive. You then ended up with a PhD. I bet you, did you ever go back to the school and say, remember me? You told me not to waste resources? I've got a PhD.
I think there was I think there's two parts of that. Like, I often joke that, like, I've spent over half my life now working in education, so hopefully not still wasting the educational resources of the education system. But when I was working at Macquarie, and I had the Pro Vice Chancellor Indigenous role, I drive past my school to get to work every day. And like, I had two feelings. One feeling was, I wish I could go back to that teacher now and like, show them who I am now. And like, I probably, like, I'm sure I have more educational qualifications than they would have. So there was that sort of, that sort of feeling of, I'll show you. But there was also a feeling of, oh my God, what am I doing in a senior position in a university? Like, I definitely held that really strong imposter syndrome of, I didn't even get through school, and here I am in a senior position. Like, and especially like, and one thing as a Pro Vice Chancellor, but like even more so as a Deputy Vice Chancellor, because my responsibility is not only to Indigenous higher education as a DVC, obviously as a DVC, as you know, Judith, but like, you have a responsibility for all of the business of the university and having influence and connection in there. So I don't think, particularly in our space where we haven't held these positions before, I think that's a bit of a space that there's not that realization of the big jump between a Pro Vice Chancellor and a Deputy Vice Chancellor. But yes, so like, I definitely still carry that a little bit with me. But I just keep myself busy. There's too much else to do than to sort of dwell on that.
But to me, that gives your voice more authenticity about how schools can fail students and students can still be successful by finding other routes. So, in fact, the fact that you talked about pathways, I think that, and particularly harmonisation, this is the new opportunity for higher education, harmonisation, and finding students like you who actually can be successful. Schools just didn't serve them very well.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah.
So tell me a bit about the role of Deputy Vice Chancellor at UNSW. What keeps you awake at night?
Yeah. I'll flip back to the reconciliation thing
Yep.
a little bit here, um, because when I first arrived on when I first came to UNSW, it was 2 weeks before the referendum,
Mhm.
and it was quite outstanding. Like, UNSW didn't just make just a average, we're going to support the voice. Like, some universities, said, no, we're not going to do anything. Like, we'll just let it ride. Some universities sort of sat on the fence a bit, said, oh, yeah, we're supportive, but we're not going to, be too loud about it. Um, can I say UNSW was loud and proud? I
Well,
have
you had one of
never.
the great constitutional lawyers there too.
That's right. Like, Megan Davis definitely did a fantastic job of, convincing UNSW to be completely committed. And the Vice Chancellor said to me, Attila said to me when I started, our commitment isn't just to the voice. Our commitment is to all of the principles of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And credit to Megan for creating that culture and environment, because you couldn't walk 2 steps without seeing the voice or the Uluru Statement from the Heart posters on poles, in windows, students, Indigenous and non-Indigenous students in the main quadrangle outside the green area outside the library,
Mm.
which I was overlooking because my office at first was overlooking that area. Would have Aboriginal flags out. They would be on microphones. They would be advocating strongly for for the voice, and Indigenous, non-Indigenous staff, with shirts and badges and bags, and it was just, I have never been in an environment where it was so in your face, especially a university environment, which I was really proud of, because I think that it's a bit sad that universities to some extent have lost the activism that they had back in the 70s. And and at night, all the buildings would all of a sudden light up with yes written all over them and stuff. It was quite an outstanding environment to be in. And although we lost the referendum, it still created a real pride to sort of be in a place that was willing to put themselves out there, in a university that was willing to put themselves out there and really stand for what they believed in. But I think it really also positioned the university in a certain way, particularly because we were working on our new strategy, which was again what attracted me. I was very worried about coming to a GOA. They
Mm.
haven't had a great reputation for Indigenous higher education. But there was two things. Well, there's three things. There was Megan and the work that she was doing. And I'm really grateful that Megan is now a part of our team in the
Mhm.
DVCI office. And there was Attila, and our Vice Chancellor, who had done wonderful things at UTS and had recently moved over to UNSW. And there was the vision of societal impact, that the new strategy would uh, ultimately focus on societal impact and how universities could leverage their expertise and their resources to make a difference in communities or in society more broadly, nationally and globally, or locally, nationally and globally. And those things were really attractive to me. So, it, go back to 2 weeks before the referendum, we have the referendum. Obviously, during that time too, we were dealing with such heightened racism and vilification as well. On people traveling in trains, like our staff and students traveling in trains and getting attacked, and the social media was horrific, and so we were also having to respond to that. So then having a loss of the referendum, I think really impacted the language of reconciliation in our communities. And it became a very heavy and difficult word to talk to afterwards, and you sort of heard a lot of comments about, oh, reconciliation's dead, and like, how can we talk about reconciliation when, like, but like, it was more complex than that. And Megan and her team are still doing some wonderful work out in communities with the Uluru Dialogues, talking about, like, why did people vote yes or why did people vote no, and trying to understand more, like, the very complex uh, opportunities and challenges around those conversations. Um, and so we sort of changed our focus to look at to really focus around uh, not the language of reconciliation, but voice agency in action. And so we talked about it. So one of the first jobs that I was given coming to the to UNSW was, can you refresh the Indigenous strategy? It was coming to an end last year in 2025, and so it needs to be refreshed. And Megan had led the development of that strategy. And so at the time, Dr. Cara Cross, who's now our Executive Director, Indigenous Students, she just come over from Macquarie actually as as my executive officer, and she said to me, look, Professor Kevin Lowe in education has been doing this research and with schools and communities, and they've been developing what they've been calling micro treaties, which are coined micro treaties, and where it gives community agency with in the relationship with schools. And she said, like, maybe given our commitment to the principles of the Uluru Statement, maybe that's sort of where we can go, where we can actually give our communities voice and agency. And it really made sense because up until recently, Indigenous strategies have been really great, and reconciliation action plans. People have universities have either done Indigenous strategies or reconciliation action plans or both. And they have been they've been great in progressing our targets within universities, our staff, our students, our curriculum, our research, our engagement. But they all pretty much look the same, and they're all very much driven from inside. And the targets that we set are very much inside targets. They're like, about. And then it becomes this competition, like, how many students have you got? You're like, I've got this many students, or I've got this many staff, like, but what's the end game? Like, having more students and more staff and quality Indigenous curriculum and quality Indigenous research. What is actually the end game that we're trying to achieve in all of that? And we don't really think about that. We think about the internal mechanisms without thinking about the external impact factors. And so, we thought we'd have the micro treaty done in like 18 months. George Williams, who was at UNSW at the time, said we were being very ambitious, and we're 2.5 years in and we're only halfway through. But it's all in the journey. But it has been great, like, talking to communities about, like, going through a process that actually gives them agency and allows them to actually determine what the commitments of the university should be. And I think that was really needed because our conversation started right after the referendum. And I think it was a really needed conversation to actually give communities hope that, like, we can still keep on moving forward in a way that that gives them determination and agency. And at the same time, obviously we had the report of the Accord come out that was positioning Indigenous peoples at the heart of the education system. So in the work that we were doing, it really allowed us to consider, what does that mean? What does that mean for the work that we're doing in around voice, agency, and action? And how does that sit at the heart of our institution and therefore the education system? And so like, they're the sort of things that we've been really mindful of. Sorry, Judith, did you want me to stop and just?
No, I'm just, in fact, that sort of voice, agency, and action is such a nice condensation of reconciliation. people can remember those words, and then
Yeah.
it gives an easier translation and application into practice. So what do you reckon particularly in terms of the action one, if you're there yet, what's the thing that in terms of reconciliation at UNSW you think others can learn from?
Yeah. I think that so when we did I'll just use an example. So
Mm-hmm.
when we developed the Progress for All strategy, which is a new UNSW strategy that was launched last year, it was it's when you look at it, it's very much immersed around a societal impact framework. And it has there's societal impact goals. So there's everything that a university will have: education, research, engagement. But it has four societal impact goals that came about from, like, just extensive consultation. And so the four goals are healthy lives, uh, uh, environmental sustainability or net zero, uh, uh, economic and social prosperity, and resilience, social cohesion, and security. Maybe not in that way, but like they're the three areas. And in the middle is Indigenous knowledges, and so which was really funny, because a few months after we released it, that they released the National Science and Innovation framework, which was looked very similar. But so then it was up to, all of a sudden we had everyone across the university, particularly non-Indigenous scholars and staff, saying, "Oh, how do we actually reflect that? Like, what do we need to do to actually represent the centering of Indigenous knowledges, or how do we articulate that in our work?" Um, and so a couple of things. One of the things that Attila allowed me to do when I started at UNSW was to build a leadership team. Most universities have a pro vice chancellor or a deputy vice chancellor. A couple of universities have a deputy vice chancellor and a pro vice chancellor. But we have a deputy vice chancellor, three pro vice chancellors, and an executive director, Indigenous students, which is equivalent to a PVC, but a professional position. So we have an extensive leadership team so that we can have such strong engagement across the university in around all the core business of the university. So I think that was really important, because what DVC doesn't have a leadership team around them. Like, most Indigenous DVCs, but not very many DVC academics, DVC research, DVC engagement. They never not have a leadership team. So I think that was a really important move. And secondly, we've been developing an academy, which is a Indigenous Societal Impact Academy. And this is breaking news. Where we can bring together coalitions of Indigenous and non-Indigenous staff, and industry and government and community, and bring everyone together to actually identify how we work to respond to societal impact. And particularly around those societal impact goals, because all of those societal impact goals are so important for our Indigenous communities. And so, and also considering that, we put a lot of thought into how we also work with our students in bringing them along the journey as well, because obviously students are just, like, the center of what we do. And at UNSW, there's something that people weren't talking about when I arrived, was that 42% of our students are postgraduate. And so, which would be common in GOH to have such a high postgraduate population, yet we still continue to focus on undergrad and not actually recognize the opportunities and potential that we have in our postgraduate population and communities. And so I suppose, well, one, it was about developing relationships with non-Indigenous community internally and externally. And I talked about the work that Megan's doing as well, because I think that's important for what we do inside of UNSW. And two, it was about setting up some sort of body that would allow people to formally connect and work together to actually build great things, and to achieve wonderful things together. I'm just so excited that UNSW has taken this external vision to what they do, and not just internalistically measure what everything's what always has been measured by universities. Yeah. The
Look,
other
Leanne,
thing,
the last question that I'd like to ask, and it builds on what you're saying, is Indigenous knowledges being incorporated into the curriculum are talked about a lot, but it's both a pedagogical issue, it's a cultural issue, and it's also, in inverted commas, a political issue. What advice can you give to people working in universities about incorporating Indigenous knowledges into the curriculum?
yeah. That's a good question. And it's something that we've been talking about for so long, over a decade now. And I'm not sure if anyone's actually got it right. And from the political perspective, when we first started talking about the academy, we started talking about it being called Indigenous Knowledges and Societal Impact Academy. And we took the Indigenous knowledges off, and one of the reasons was, this wasn't the ultimate reason, but one of the reasons was that we didn't want the political distraction of people coming in on Indigenous knowledges and not actually recognising the societal impact piece. So, uh, um, but um, but also, there was the confusion between Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous studies as well. And Indigenous studies has long been a discipline within universities. We started seeing Indigenous studies coming to fruition within universities in the 80s, late 80s. And then all of a sudden, in the last decade, people start talking about Indigenous knowledges, and and so I think there is still a confusion over what is Indigenous studies and what is Indigenous knowledges. And I think that what we're trying to embed is probably a little bit of both. And so I think that I think that we did it really well at Macquarie, actually, because it was completely embedded into the curriculum architecture, so into the policy setting of the university, which meant that systematically, because I think that sometimes this is our problem. We look at things and we do things that are programmatic. So they're very much reliant on goodwill of the person that develops them, people that are involved in them. But if those people move on, and then you're back to where you started from. And where we really need to make a difference is we need to have systemic change. So what does systemic change look like? It means actually embedding within the policies and procedures and systems of universities, and not just having something that's developed on the side as a nice program. Which, don't get me wrong, programs that, nice programs have achieved great things, but you may find that, a little bit down the track, they're no longer there because of whatever. Funding or resourcing or people change. So if it's systemic, then it doesn't matter if people come in or out. If there has to be resources attached to it, and there has to be a process that goes through a senior governance committee. So by having the Indigenous curriculum objectives within the curriculum architecture, it meant that academic board or academic senate were responsible parties. Obviously, we have Indigenous-led leadership and resources that work with there, but it makes it easier for them to do their job if they can leverage on the systems and structures. And then, you've got the program review cycles that because it's in the system. It's part of that process automatically. You're not having to argue and fight all the time for every little step that you make. Like, you do it right from the beginning. I don't know, just flash through my head that idea of like, having your child, like, sleeping in your bed every night. And then just letting that happen. It actually creates a bigger problem in the end, trying to get them to move into their own, then put up for that, like, a couple of weeks of them crying and tantruming in their own bedroom. And then in the long term, like, it's a lot easier on you. I don't know why that flashed in my mind, but it did. That, like, take it, like, put up with the crying and tantrums in the short term, get it in the systems, get it where it should be in the processes of the university, and in the longer term, then, like, you're going to get a better sleep because
So what I'm
because it's
hearing,
going to be an easier journey.
so what I'm hearing you saying, it's actually got to be connected and it's got to be glued. And it's
Yep.
got to be, it requires good governance.
Yep.
And with that good governance, it then becomes incorporated into the culture. It's the way we do things around here.
Yep, definitely. And like, we need to have positive, respectful, reciprocal relationships. Like, there's no use being, there's no use being confrontational, or like, or trying to make people feel bad for I agree with truth telling, but I believe in truth telling for productivity and for action. And so I think that's an important distinction that we've got to remember. But I also think that we need to philosophize on things as well, particularly in our space. We've spent so much time trying to catch up. Like, we haven't been in higher education for all that long in the whole scheme of things from a Western perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've spent all this time playing catch up and being reactive to everything that happens. And I've noticed that lately, sometimes we sort of change our views on what we had, like, a decade ago, because it is a learning experience for us. We haven't been here before. And so, like, I think that, and because we sort of have this urgency of everything needed to happen yesterday because we are playing that catch up, then we don't give ourselves enough time to actually philosophize, if that's a word, over where we've been, where we're at, and the legacy that we have, the responsibility for our future 7 generations. And so I think that's I've been trying at UNSW to sort of create that space a little bit more, particularly for our Indigenous community, so that we can understand a little bit more about what are the challenges and what are the opportunities.
Leanne, this has been a remarkable conversation, and I'm just looking down at my notes, and you live the agenda of social impact in terms of your portfolio and your interpretation of reconciliation, but voice, agency, and action are part of who you are. So thank you very much for giving me nearly 45 minutes of your time. And so I've enjoyed it. I hope you've enjoyed it. And thanks again. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
You have been listening to Studiosity's podcast, Reimagining Higher Education, candid conversations within higher education, sharing stories of leadership, change, and best practice in teaching and learning. Visit studiosity.com.